Radio Mano Papachango.
Yes, I'm here with Jenny Odell. Jenny, thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
I came across your book. I have to be honest, I've only read a little bit of it, and there's a congruent reason for that, which is that, I mean, the reason I really like the idea and the reason I've only read a bit of it is that I'm lazy. And so the idea of the value of doing nothing speaks to me so clearly. I don't know what you know about what I do, but I've studied hunter-gatherers for a long time. And I'm very suspicious of the American work ethic and ambition and getting ahead and getting, social media followers and money and fame and all that stuff just strikes me as bullshit from the get-go. So when I saw that you'd written a book about the value of fallow time, I thought, oh yeah, this is a book I'm definitely going to read later.
That makes sense.
So can you tell me the story? How does a book about I'm guessing what the book's about. Maybe I'll open it up and it'll all be about working hard at meditation or something. But how does a book like this come to be?
So it has a pretty specific origin story, which is that basically after the 2016 election, which also around that time, I live in Oakland, there was a catastrophic warehouse fire that a lot of people died in. And some of them were friends of friends. So essentially it was like this kind of traumatic time for me and just a lot of people I know who especially are artists and writers, because my background is in art. And there was this kind of collective feeling of like paralysis and not knowing what to do. Like, what is it worth making anything? Does any of my work have meaning? And just this kind of shock. And so I found myself sort of intuitively going to this rose garden that I live about 5 minutes away from. It's like a municipal rose garden in the middle of Oakland, and just sitting there and not doing anything. And then starting to become sort of curious about why I was doing that and why that felt necessary. And then at that time, I happened to be asked to give a talk the following summer at a conference that tends to have also a lot of artists at it, who I thought maybe artists who are very online, I should say. And so I had to submit a talk title. I was given a blank slate, I could talk about whatever I wanted. And I just kind of looked at the circumstances that I was in, and I submitted the talk title, How to Do Nothing, without any talk actually existing yet. And then I spent the next couple months thinking more about like what the difference was between how I felt in that space of that park versus how I felt the whole rest of the day, especially, not only interfacing with the news, but just like social media, hysteria, emotional reaction, and just kind of not being able to find any like emptiness or just kind of space to like think and process. So really the whole talk is just an argument for the need for spaces and times for reflection and listening and receptivity versus like knee-jerk reaction, production, things that we consider productive in the traditional sort of Western American sense. And I gave that talk in the summer of 2017. And then actually an author, Adam Greenfield, who had been at that talk, emailed me out of the blue and said, I think this could be a book. Have you ever considered that? Which I had not. And I had put the transcript of the talk online, and it kind of spread around a lot more than I expected because it's really long. It's a 45-minute talk. But he really helped me so much, and just kind of, this is what the process looks like. And I had a lot of help from people, given that my background is in art. I didn't have an agent or anything like that. So really, the book has just been such, everything about it has been surprising to me. Like the fact that it got done, and how it came into existence, but even more so like that it would be relatable and resonant to anyone outside of that really specific community or my own head, is still surprising to me to this day.
So it's surprising to you, but you must have some explanation for why it's hit a nerve. Have you thought that through?
Yeah, I have my theories, and I think I heard from a lot of readers things like I'd been having these kinds of thoughts for a long time, but you gave them a name, or things like that. You put your finger on something. So I heard so many different versions of that, and I like to think that the reason it caught on was that, like readers aren't stupid. I really believe like people aren't stupid. And this kind of like literature of the quick fix, the dumbed down version of a problem, it may look like that sells well, but I don't think that's what people really want. And I really struggled, and I'm having this struggle again right now because I'm writing another book. I really struggled to try to stay true to the complexity of the problem and not just say like, oh, you need to put your phone away, and pretend like these problems of attention aren't linked to like much wider systems, right? And I tried not to shy away from that, and I think like that is just closer to the truth of like, how these problems are interconnected, and I think that just felt like a relief for some people to just hear someone make that connection, right? Like, the fact that the whole first half of the book is basically about technology, but then the second half is about ecology, and like kind of trying to draw these parallels between the ecology of an ecosystem and the ecology of like thought and speech as it plays out on Twitter, and using metaphors of like erosion and not having any ground cover, just trying to put these different domains like in conversation with each other. Like some people definitely got frustrated with that. I think they wanted the quick fix book, and it has how to in the title, and I feel a little bit bad, but I think there are just as many people who were pleasantly surprised by how much is encompassed in this kind of compost pile.
A compost pile. It's a nice way to describe a book. It is. I mean, it's a place where your production goes, and you hope that it interacts in a way that creates fertility, right, for things to grow out of. How did you find the process of writing a book as someone who's done? I know you've done a lot of conceptual art. I was looking at your webpage earlier. Some really interesting conceptual approaches to things, like tracing the power from Yosemite to particular buildings or I guess neighborhoods in San Francisco, and reenacting Google Street View photos or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever heard, it's totally an aside, but have you ever heard of the Museum of Jurassic Technology?
Yes, I have been there.
Good. Okay.
Loved it. I never wanted to leave.
Yeah. It started when I was looking at your webpage. I thought, she's got to check this place out. If she's never been there, this is a good place. All right. Yeah, well, I'm glad
I love that place.
It's in LA for anyone listening.
Yeah, it's totally. Well, when we can visit places like that again, very much recommend. And it's also one of those things where, when enough people recommend something to you enough that you almost get annoyed and you don't want to do it or watch it. That's what happened with that. Every person who looked at my work was like, or friends were just like, oh, Museum of Jurassic Technology, it's so cool. And like, I just was like, okay. And then I finally went, and I felt so stupid for not having gone sooner. Yeah.
I had that experience with Pink Floyd, the band.
Yeah.
I was pumping gas. I worked in a gas station when I was in high school, and this guy I worked with, who, we knew each other kind of, and at some point he was like, dude, you should check out a band named Pink Floyd. I think you'd really like them. And the only song I'd ever heard by Pink Floyd was the song Money that starts with the cash register, right?
Yeah.
And I hated it. I hated the sound of the cash register and the down, and the bells and all that. And I thought, that band sucks. And I wasn't even smart enough to listen to the words to realize that Money was a song about what a bunch of bullshit money is. So I didn't even get the subversive quality of it. And for years, I thought Pink Floyd sucked. And then I was in college, and I think I was probably tripping on mushrooms or something, and somebody put on Dark Side of the Moon, and I was like, nice. This is the greatest thing I've ever heard. What an idiot I am. Yeah. Anyway.
You had to find your way there.
I guess, but so that poor guy was just trying to save me some trouble, you know? I could have been digging Pink Floyd for years. I wanted to ask you, like, how did you feel? How was writing a book? What was that process like for you as someone who's worked in other mediums?
It's surprisingly similar, only because, and you could probably get a sense of this from, the projects on my website. My artistic practice was always really research-based. So I actually, and I majored in English for undergrad. And I, in retrospect, I think that maybe, when I went to grad school after that, I was modeling my process of making on like writing a research paper, because that's actually what I was trained to do. And I am I don't know how to describe it. My curiosity is sometimes a problem for me. Actually, it's quite often a problem for me in terms of like work and burnout. I'm having that issue right now with this book where it's like, I am just a very curious person, and I will very easily go down various rabbit holes and lose track of time, and forget why I even asked the question in the first place. Like, that's just kind of the way that my brain works. So, both in the art projects that I made and the writing, there's this process of like just kind of going out there. Out there could mean a bunch of academic journals or the library or Google Maps, like in the case of some of the art that I've made, or when I was an artist in residence at the dump, it was like going into the dump, right? But the thing that these have in common is like going into some sort of space that has some kind of material in it, or information, and then digging through that. And that's always the point where I almost get stuck, because I like that part so much more than any of the rest of it. So I could just get stuck, for example, right now with just like learning more and more and more about the thing that I'm trying to write this chapter about. But like at some point I need to write the chapter and decide like what's going to be in it. So, but I used to have that same problem with art, where I would make these collages of things cut out from Google Maps. And it's like, I could just spend all day on Google Maps and never actually get to the point where I make anything. So there's always, in all of my work, there's that tension between finding and making. Like, I like finding almost more than making, and making is maybe an excuse just to do the finding. But I do try to, in both cases, I try to communicate my enthusiasm to the viewer / reader, and kind of like, it's like I want you to be at the dump with me, like digging through the trash, like in your encounter with the project somehow.
Right. And communicating that enthusiasm can be problematic if you aren't sensitive to them. I'm talking about my own creative process here, so maybe I'm projecting something onto you, but there's a period when I'm working on a book where I'm really excited about the ideas, and I'm doing the thing you're doing where I'm just researching, and I just want to know everything there is to know about this, partly because of just pure curiosity and the joy of learning, and partly terror of being wrong and publishing a book and having someone go, but are you not aware of this entire line of research? But I've had a problem in my last book where I feel like I went too far, and it was almost like I was trying to surf a wave and I let the wave go past me, and then I had to swim into the beach, rather than ride the wave. Because I spent so long working on it that the real fun and the sort of sense of discovery had grown stale by the time I finished it. You know what I'm talking about? Is that a danger for you in the research phase, or do you know when to switch into the building phase?
I don't know that I have only ever had the problem of getting stuck in the curiosity side of things. Maybe because I tend to just start asking related questions. You know what I mean? So it's just like always like spreading out, and that's how it can get very far off topic. But I also I'm being reminded now, going through the process again, that I kind of go back and forth. So I do a lot of research, and then I start writing, but then it becomes clear through the process of writing that there's other stuff that I need to get. And so I'm just kind of constantly going back and forth. And again, it quite honestly, it reminds me of making those collages, because what I used to do was cut out, say, 50 swimming pools from Google Earth, and I would put them together. And then once I saw how that looked, I would know what kinds of other swimming pools, how many other kinds, I needed, and I would go back. So it's like, I also find writing to be like a process of conversation with myself. So I'm like figuring stuff out as I'm writing, so I won't know what I need until I kind of get started. Right. So it's also like, that's another reason I tend to get stuck, because it's like sometimes the process of writing is me figuring out how little I know and how like narrow my perspective is, and then I'm like, oh god, like I need to do an entire like lifetime's worth of learning about some subjects. Yeah. There's always you're always confronting imposter syndrome when you're writing, right? I was talking to a guy named John Colapinto the other day, who's an author and a New Yorker staff writer, and he pointed out that the word authority and author come from the same root. So when you're authoring a book, you are presenting yourself as an authority. So you better be, or it looks pretty bad. And the thing is, like, I don't enjoy that, like, part of it, like the idea of the authority, because, and I talk about this in How to Do Nothing, all of my favorite art is very ego effacing. So like, conceptual art from the 60s and 70s, like, 433, which is just, basically silence, right? A lot of Fluxus art, these pieces where it was almost like all audience participation. So like, yes, the artist did set something in motion, but it wasn't like, right, it wasn't like Jackson Pollock making something, expressing himself on a blank canvas. And I have always really enjoyed that kind of gentler kind of art that's more of like a framing device for what's already there. And I strive to do that. So I really have even more problems than I would have with the idea of being an authority. And like the way that I've sort of figured out to get around that inevitability is to kind of frame the information that I have found almost like in a story of like how I learned it. So, and it's in How to Do Nothing. It's also definitely going to be in this book, where it's like here's where I started, and here's where you're starting, maybe, and like I'm going to end up somewhere very, very different, and like this is how I got there, because I really it's really important to me to not alienate readers also, and so like making a thoughtful trail that's like easy to walk, even if the things that you're looking at along the way are somewhat challenging or unfamiliar. Because, and I think some of that comes from like, this is my 7th year teaching college students, and teaching art to non-art majors. I'm very sensitive to things like the feeling that someone might have, for example, who doesn't read academic texts, but is really interested in theory, and could use these tools, that it could really help them understand things in their life. But they're usually presented in this sort of like intimidating or inaccessible way. And so I really try to kind of split the difference. Like, I don't want to dumb it down, but I also want it to be accessible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I understand that. What's the process of you? Why did you study English, I guess, is my question. Were you intending to write or teach literature when you were an undergrad, or did you just like reading books? Or because I also have my BA is also in English.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it definitely was not a pragmatic decision. I think I majored in English because I had written almost every day since I was a child. And I have a really actually sort of troubling number of journals at my parents' house. No one should have this much data about their lives. And I would write a lot, like just notebooks and notebooks. And, it's not good. It's just, that was just what I did. And I still do it. And so I think maybe part of it was like, well, this is what I already do. So it almost like wasn't even a decision. And I really loved reading. And I loved, I think I really enjoy like sort of pattern recognition. Like I like, as I've said already, kind of like drawing things into a new relationship. And so I really enjoyed that part of the English major, right? It's like, read this book, try to read between the lines of this book, or like you have a thesis about this writing, you're going to read it against the grain. I always really, really liked doing that. And I liked the idea that it could help you read other things that aren't books, right? Like have a reading of something.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And I still, I still do that. Like right now, my boyfriend is really into movies. And so we've been watching like a different movie almost every night. And we've really enjoyed like doing basically that process. Like, and he's also trying to write a script right now. So it's like just even looking at how the movie is constructed and then like noticing little details that the director did, like it's very similar to what they teach you to do in an English major. So, I think that's probably why. But I wasn't thinking about a job. That's so crazy to think about now. Like my students all have like internships and personal websites. It was very self-indulgent, but it ended up being useful. So,
here's to self-indulgence. Who were you writing to? Because I did that too. I had journals and I was writing to my future self. Who were you writing to?
I think that in some cases I was definitely writing to a future self, but more often I think I was just writing to an imagined other person because I'm an only child and my family is very small. Like I should say we're spread out. So it's like really, it was me, my mom, and my dad, and we lived in a pretty alienating suburb. So there was a lot of me sort of wandering around bored and alone. And so I think, like everybody talks to themselves, right, in their head. It's just that mine was on paper. And I don't know if it's because I find that I still have to do it by hand. Like that kind of writing. And so I somewhat suspect that it has to do with like slowing down my thought process and being able to see it, because if I can't do that, it just kind of like, it's like a truck that's like spinning out. It's going, but it's not going anywhere. And it's kind of like burning itself out. So it's kind of like, I think of it as like a thinking prosthesis or something like that.
Yeah. I get that. What movies have you been watching recently? Any, because I love movies too. Any that really struck you?
Okay, so there's
classics?
It's all over the place. It's some like indie films, and then sometimes we watch like really just like basic movies just to kind of like look at how they're structured. Some foreign stuff. There's one that I almost hesitate to recommend because we watched it and we were both just kind of like messed up for a couple days after this movie. And I think about it all the time. I'm probably going to talk about it in the book. I believe it was Swedish, but it's called Aniara. And it's a sci-fi film based on a poem, I believe, from the 50s or something like this. And I'll just say what the premise is. It's that it's in the future, and there's a commuter ship going to Mars because presumably we've ruined Earth, and the ship gets knocked off course. And the whole film is about the ship going off course. But it is like the most devastating depiction of nihilism I have ever encountered. I mean, it was like we both afterwards were like, maybe we shouldn't have watched this during the pandemic. Especially because it's like the ship in the film was kind of like a cruise ship, so everyone's stuck in their little rooms, you know? And this kind of overarching question of like, are we going to ever get anywhere? Is there a point to anything? Like, what even is the future? What does the present mean if there is no future? You know, it's just like, yeah, it was super well done, like impeccably done, but really quite difficult to like sit with afterward.
Yeah, it sounds good. I just watched Nomadland the other night.
Oh, we're watching that tonight.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I won't say much about it, other than the fact that I spend about 4 months every year living in my van. So it was really interesting to see the sort of the depiction of that type of life in the film. A lot of I don't know if you know this, but a lot of the people who appear in the film are real people who are in this community of nomads. There's kind of, you know, there's I forget the name of the actress, the lead role. You know, she's obviously an actress, but a lot of the other people, you'll notice the texture of the film. They're actual people. They're not actors. So I was thinking when you were speaking earlier about well, lots of things. One thing was I don't know if you've ever read a book. I hate to do this because I don't know how interesting it is for listeners, but when I'm talking with someone who likes reading, I just want to start throwing books at you. And, you know, have you read this? Did you like that? But there's a book in particular called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. Have you heard of this?
I have heard of it, and I've had a friend send me like a section of it. So it's been on my list for a really long time. The reason I thought of it was partly when you said earlier that you use a lot of ecological imagery or metaphor in talking about time and attention and erosion and lying fallow and things like that. That book is very much a book about. Partly it's a book about nature, but it's also a book about silence and quiet and contemplation and sort of seeing nature as a reflection of the inner self, you know, and the necessity for quiet in order to really observe what's happening. Fantastic book, really, really interesting. And also a book that I believe was written by accident. She didn't intend to write a book. She just found herself, she'd married her professor in college, I think, and then moved to this country house. And he was going off and teaching all day, and she was just sort of hanging out in this house in Virginia, I think, and just started noticing things and then wrote things down. And next thing you know, it sort of congealed into a book that was published by pure chance and became a runaway hit by word of mouth. It wasn't, you know, it was a small publisher, and I love those sorts of stories. And it sounds like your book is similar in some ways. Yeah, definitely.
Did you move on? Well, first of all, are you comfortable? Do you want to talk about the book you're working on now, or would you prefer just to not let any air out of that balloon? How do you feel about that?
I'm happy to talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's this book about?
So this book is more specifically about time. It's about different ways of seeing time. So I kind of think of it as like a series of lenses through which you can look, and time appears very differently. A really big kind of objective that I have is to take the way time appears in the everyday, of course not, you know, uniformly and not all the time every day, but the kind of like idea of the kind of time that people talk about with time management. I'll just say that, right? Like fungible units of time, and the idea of time as money. I really want to give enough historical context about how that came to be, and then also talk enough about other reckonings of time, that by the end, this way that you sort of familiarly conceive of time feels very alien, and it makes it possible for you to imagine something else, or maybe easier to imagine something else. And it kind of came out of it follows logically from How to Do Nothing, because one of the big critiques of How to Do Nothing was and is that it doesn't matter to someone who doesn't have time to do any of these things. And that really, and not just that, right? It's like, even if you do have time, not everyone experiences free time in the same way. Like, I just read this amazing essay last night called Walking While Black that I cannot recommend more highly. It's just like an amazing essay on LitHub. But it's about, like, you know, this idea of safety and like being, and the flaneur, right? And being able to go for a walk, that's not an experience that's accessible to a lot of people, especially in the US. So it's kind of like my, you know, these are things that I don't feel like I adequately addressed or was even aware of when I wrote How to Do Nothing. And so I'm trying to kind of think more seriously about this question of like, if it's true that like what I want is for everyone to have a portion of their life that does not feel like it's part of the hamster wheel, and that they can conceive of themselves outside of work, and that not all time has to be money. Like, what would that actually take? And like really just kind of go down that path, which I am struggling down right now. And even just kind of looking at the history of leisure, like the way leisure has been talked about. Yeah, so that's, and there's definitely going to be some ecological stuff in there. You know, that's one way of looking at time. Maybe some geological time. But yeah, it's time is such a broad, you know, topic, and it's connected to everything. And then I'm also realizing that, you know, this artificial division of time from space is like also itself like a completely Western thing. So it's a little bit arbitrary. But we also live in a world with time right now. I mean, like, just practically speaking, there are hours in a day that you have to attend to. Yeah.
Ever smaller units of time that are under consideration too, right? It's like agricultural time is very different from industrial time, not only in the rigidity of industrial time, but also in the subdivisions, right? Agricultural time is days and seasons, you know. I'll tell you, an interesting essay that might be informative for you is called The Original Affluent Society. It was written by
yeah.
Do you know that?
I do. Let me get my pen. I haven't read it, but I am aware of it. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, and it might be informative for you because Marshall Salins, the anthropologist who wrote it, was essentially making an economic argument that, you know, we look at hunter-gatherer people as impoverished because they don't have a lot of material possessions, which is how we measure wealth, right? But if you look at it from another perspective, you find that their diet typically is actually extremely rich, much more nutritious than the modern diet, even among affluent people. Their sort of happiness, their sense of community, their sense of meaning in life, you know, all these things that are actually much more important and ultimately more accurate matrices of quality of life, they're very rich. And that there's a great deal of wealth in feeling that you're not lacking anything. It's not really about how much you have, it's how much you lack, right? And he also talks about time, and one of the revolutionary findings of that he presented in that paper was that hunter-gatherers work, and I'm doing air quotes, around 12 to 14 hours a week, and depending, some up to 20 hours a week, right? And that provides everything they need. That's the food, the shelter, hunting, cooking, childcare, etc. And then he breaks it down further and says, but most of these forms of work that we're talking about are things that we do in our leisure time. Hunting, fishing, telling stories, playing with children, childcare, things that we consider to be work that they, or that we consider to be play that, we're counting as work because they're necessary activities. So in terms of time, hunter-gatherers have massive amounts of free time, far more than the average, modern person. There's a story, an anecdote I told in Civilized to Death about a filmmaker who went to Papua New Guinea and lived with hunter-gatherer people there, and then ended up inviting them to London, and they spent a few weeks in England. And there was this moment in the morning where they were sitting around the table, and the producer whose house they were at had to, he was like, okay, got to go to work. And the hunter-gatherer guy said, where do you go all day? And he said, what, work? And I have to work. And they okay, why? You're away from your family, and, you leave and it's still dark, and you come home, it's dark. Where are you in the day? And he explained the need for money and all that, and to pay for the house. And they said, how many days do you have to work to pay for the house? And he said, 30 years. And they were like, yeah. When we want a house, we get together, we build a house in a couple of days. 30 years? Anyway, so this is just my lens on things. But this whole, what is the innate human relationship with time? We're living in machine time. It's totally different.
Yeah, I mean, there is, of course, we are mortal, so there's always going to be time scarcity, some sense of time scarcity is arguably sort of unavoidable, although you could say mindfulness, kind of Buddhism, or
believing in reincarnation,
right,
or life after death, all that.
Yeah, but I do think it's it's important to acknowledge that there is, for a lot of people, a very basic sense of the clock running down, just because that's how life is. But one thing that's been really interesting for me to learn about that I had no clue was how recent and how contested the idea of wage labor was in the U.S. I'm reading this book right now about that kind of struggle, this transitional moment in the 19th century where it was people used to talk about working for wages as shameful, humiliating, renting yourself out. And then gradually there was this kind of shift more towards fighting for a living wage. So you take the wage for granted, and now you're fighting for a living wage, which is now, pretty much where we're at. And then there's, I'm also in the middle of, I actually have it right here. This book, which I also highly recommend, The Problem with Work, by Kathy Weeks, who also talks about the wage thing. But you could just read even the introduction of this book, it'll just totally stand everything on its head. She's kind of okay, there's all this, activism around the living wage and things like this, but why doesn't anyone question the idea of work? And why doesn't anyone question the fact that work is so anti-democratic, but it's where we spend all of our time? This whole sphere of our lives, right? If you work for someone else, especially if you work for a wage, or even if you work for a salary, it's you have to abide by those rules or you are gone. And it's I don't know, maybe that's naive of me because I, in my teaching job, I've been so unsupervised, and I work by myself, and I barely ever even see other adjuncts. But, I've worked in other places, and I think about it now, and I'm that is odd. And it's just so taken for granted. You're born into a world where everybody, that's what you do. You work for a wage, find someone to work for. And it's
I've always found it really strange when someone talks about their boss.
Yeah.
I don't know why they don't feel embarrassed to say that word. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like my owner or something, you know,
Yeah.
my superior. Like, what are you talking about? It really throws into stark contrast what you're talking about, that deeply hierarchical reality that's taken for granted.
Yeah. And that this is something that you need to do for your whole life until the point that you can't anymore, at which point you are of less sort of value to society. Like there's a really interesting part of The Problem with Work where she talks about UBI as like, you know, on the one hand, it's like a proposal for an actual thing. But on the other hand, she sort of considers it like something that gestures in a sort of utopian direction of like thinking about how we might value people in other ways than simply what they produce. Because obviously that has implications for, you know, disabled people, elderly people, you know, people who don't work for whatever reason, right? Like work that's recognized as work.
Right.
And to some extent children, although you can say that like children are being sort of invested in to become future workers. But it's interesting that she talks about it that way, where it's like, it could be this sort of tool for thinking about a different system of value for people in a community.
Well, and I don't know if she mentions Salins, or any research into hunter-gatherers, but UBI is very much a reflection of a hunter-gatherer society, where egalitarianism is the sort of central organizing principle, and food is shared no matter who's the best hunter, no matter who's strongest or, you know, most attractive or funniest or whatever qualities. The sort of equitable sharing of resources is sort of the one thing you can never, the one line you can't cross. If you're caught hoarding food or keeping resources away from the collective, that's the worst thing you can do in a hunter-gatherer society. So this idea of like, okay, you're not working, doesn't matter. We have enough. Everyone's welcome. Everyone gets their share is very much, I would argue, a deeply human impulse, which is why inequitable distribution of resources is so painful for us. And not just for the people at the bottom, for the people at the top. It's really hard to be wealthy in a brutal society.
Yeah, it's alienating.
Anyway, I'm ranting, sorry. I'm host-splaining. I tend to do that sometimes. You know, I was thinking how your book is and you know, maybe I'm seeing patterns where there aren't any, but it seems to me that there's been in recent years sort of a genre of books that go against this accelerating impulse toward efficiency and towing the line and getting rich and, you know, just accumulation. Like I'm thinking of a guy named Mark Manson wrote a book called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Mm-hmm. I had him on the podcast. And I actually, it was kind of painful when that book came out and has done so well, because I had thought about writing a book like that. When I was invited to give a TED Talk, I was like, maybe I should talk about the importance of not taking this shit seriously. You know, like what a, you know, anyway, I didn't. I talked about prehistoric sex instead. But, you know, do you see your book as part of a response to this increasing pressure? Or do you think that there's maybe there's a ready audience for this sort of message due to the fact that young millennials and people younger than millennials are coming into this situation and saying the American dream, that's not even actually available anymore. Like you know what I mean? We're struggling just to survive and pay the rent. We're not worried about accumulating wealth. Like that's inaccessible. So we need to find other ways toward happiness and fulfillment.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I saw it when I started writing it. I was so, it was just kind of me in my corner. I mean, I wrote it in my art studio in downtown Oakland, and I hadn't sort of yet connected it to these other like very similar thought processes that were going on. In retrospect, I mean, I think it's definitely part of like sort of general reaction to this like dehumanizing experience of being like measured and observed all the time, and being sort of called to account for your time, and not having anything for yourself. I mean, the book is dedicated to my students, who, I teach at Stanford, so a lot of them are subject to this like optimization culture, and they're just tired. So I think that I was tapping into that a little bit, just, having experienced it myself, but also just being kind of seeing that over and over again. But I don't know, it's interesting because, just to go back to the stuff that I've been reading, like one thing that I've been really fascinated by, I don't know if it's like inspiring or depressing, but to just actually like read about how long it took to get the 8-hour workday, like how it's so long. Like I'm reading this book that's only about that. And it's well, I don't know how big it is because I'm reading it online, but it's a long book, and it's just like, it's actually quite stultifying because every chapter is like, in 1863, there was, in this town, there was an 8-hour or 10-hour, 8-hour movement. And then in 1864, in this town, there was a 8-hour picnic and 6,000 people came. And it's just like over and over. And in your head, like, this is a long movie, right? Like it ends in like the 20th century. And I've been thinking about it a lot because it's like, you basically have this record of like a significant collective impulse for the workday to be shortened. That was like, in some places, like kind of common knowledge, it sounds like it was just a thing that was like top of mind, and it still took that long. And so I'm like, one part of me is depressed that it took that long, and then another part of me is inspired that just kept going until it was a reality. Although you can also say, there's a whole complication with that, because it's like the 8-hour workday was also like in part to get people to consume more. So, but basically, like, I just thinking about like this feelings that are like sort of commonplace or like kind of like simmering under the surface, that you can probably like talk to, a few people and someone is going to voice something about it, right? Like these truisms like, oh, social media is terrible, right? It's like, it's very common to hear that. And yet, like, have any social media tech companies been regulated meaningfully? No. And it's like, I'm a little bit pessimistic about it. So it's like this strange dissonance, right? Between, it's like what I think a lot of people feel and what a lot of people want. I mean, just this morning, I was like walking around thinking about how, I sort of hate Twitter, but then there's also these amazing scholars on Twitter and people doing research, and who are parts of communities that I wouldn't know about otherwise. And their work is amazing. And they're also clearly like using Twitter to talk to, to share their work, to talk to each other, to have conversations. And like, that's really meaningful. And I was just like so frustrated that we didn't have some, alternative that caught on, right? I mean, there are alternatives. They just haven't really caught on in a widespread way, like Mastodon or things like this.
Alternative social media platforms?
Yeah.
And what kind of alternative would be superior?
Like basically a not for profit, like a non-commercial, like something that my boyfriend and I have been talking about a lot on our like pandemic walks is like this idea that, and this probably depends on like how you use social media and like what your feed looks like, but as a platform, like things like Twitter and Instagram, it's a little bit gamified, right? Like there's a way that you're supposed to play. You don't have to play that way, but there's a way that you're supposed to, and there is a sort of stated objective of like you're supposed to get engagement, like retweets, comments, likes, things like this. You're supposed to gain followers. again, no, you don't have to do those things, but it is strongly suggested by the platform that you do those things. And then that has all kinds of effects on the way people talk and the kinds of statements they make and the way information, circulates and the emotional register of things. And I was telling him about how I was doing all these desperate things to try to get Twitter to be like what I wanted it to be. Like, I was like, oh, I found this Chrome plugin that makes trending topics go away, and which is amazing. And then I was like, and then I have this really carefully curated list. And then I resorted to using an RSS reader and putting like people's Twitter accounts in there. I was like jumping through all these hoops to try to get it to not have the problems that I dislike. And my boyfriend Joe was like, at a certain point, like, you're trying to make the game be what it's not. Like, it is a game that is meant to be won like this. And yeah, you can sort of do stuff in it, but it is what it is, and it's structured the way it is for a reason. There are trending topics for a reason, because that draws you in and you spend more time on the site and you see more ads and you contribute more data. So it's like I get frustrated that I have to engage with things that feel genuine, whether that's like in the realm of like friendship or learning from others, in what feels like a mall. Like, I would love it if we could be in a park instead of the mall.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. As you were talking, I think about this pretty often. Brain configuration in relation to social media. And, I was in my 30s when the internet really started taking off, in my early 30s. I was in grad school. And I remember at the time thinking, this is pretty amazing, because I was in grad school in San Francisco, but I wanted to be living in Spain, where I had been. I came back for grad school, and I very quickly realized, like, wait a minute, I could like be anywhere and send in papers and, email with professors and, like, this could really revolutionize my little life, but I don't know that I thought about it in a global sense. But I often think about people who are being raised in this environment, who are, engaging with social media from a very young age, and how differently their brains must be organized. Because as you were talking, like, trending topics makes trending topics go away. And I thought, I never look at trending topics. Like, zero. I know it's there off to the right or the left or wherever it is, but I never look at it. Partly because I'm disengaged from a lot of the stuff that I guess, like, I'll see in the news, so-and-so died. And I'm like, I have no idea who that person was, or whoever sang at the Super Bowl at halftime, never heard of him before, that singer, and so it's nice being at a certain, I don't know whether it's an age or it's generational, if it's like pre-social media or if it's over 50, you know what I mean? I don't know if 50-year-olds who were born in 1988 will be as disengaged as I am. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I will say that even within a sort of generational group, I think there's a way bigger variety than is commonly thought. I mean, that's been my experience. Like, I sometimes will have a student, like, I'll have an assignment because my class is about digital art, so there's a lot of internet stuff, and I'll be like, oh, use your, something social media account, and I'll have a student who's like, I just don't do social media. And I'm like, well, and then, their modes, even their modes of engaging with it are quite different among them, as individuals, like the kinds of things that they look at and the reasons that they look at things. I've really like just been able to see that kind of firsthand. And I guess I should also say, like, I also never look at trending topics. It just bothers me that it's there. It's more of like I don't, because it's like, I don't like the fact that I don't have the choice to make that go away within the interface.
Right.
So like, I mean, it's kind of a silly comparison, but like I often reference Craigslist as like a very different kind of website where you are interacting with other people, right? Like you need a chair and you go to Craigslist and somebody has a chair and you meet up, you get the chair. At no point did you have to make an account. Craigslist is not emailing you about other chairs after that. You don't get points. You don't have to rate the chair. Like you just got the chair and
yeah.
And it's like, and in that equation, it's sort of like the disappearing agent. Like it gave you what you needed and then it went away. And on top of that, it's an incredibly lightweight website, like just in terms of how it looks. And that's like not a small thing. Like there are places where data is really expensive. And so like this idea of having like a utilitarian, lightweight, like quiet, relatively website that just does the one thing that you asked it to do. And it's such a contrast with like something like Facebook where it's like, I mean, my Facebook account is basically dead, but, you know, every couple months or so when I like log in, I'm like, what is even going on here? Like, what are all of these things? And usually what you wanted was like simple. It's like I needed the URL for an event, or like I needed to send a message. And instead I'm getting all of this other stuff, you know, to say nothing of the whole, like, you know, the collecting of data and ads and all that, but just simply on the level of like, I want technology to be a tool and I want to feel agency, like with regard to that tool and be able to change it to be what I want it to be. And that, you know, I just had Claire Evans speak in my class yesterday. She wrote Broadband, which is the book about women who contributed to sort of the history of the internet and technology. And she was talking about...
great title.
Yeah, right.
That's really good.
She was talking about Echo, which was a BBS that was run by Stacey Horn, who kind of came from outside of the, like, you know, techie community. And she was in New York, which, you know, everyone else was here. But just even hearing her talk about that, like this, you know, this woman who just, you know, had this setup in her apartment, and she had a very personal relationship to this thing that she designed. And when someone left the group, she would call them and ask them like if something had gone wrong, or, you know, or like what she could do to help. Just that kind of relationship, right? Versus like me going to Facebook, like I not only don't have any control over what's happening here, I don't even understand what's going on here. And I have my only option is to go click through it in the way that's been set up for me to do so.
Do you think, I mean, having looked at this sort of progression from a historical perspective, do you think it's sort of an inexorable slide into techno-domination, or is it a pendulum kind of thing? Like, for example, in media, I don't know to what extent you're aware of Substack, you know, which is sort of a return to a blog, independent platform, very minimalist, which in some ways could be seen as a reaction to the Facebooks and the, you know, the sort of overly complicated techno-dominance and sort of giving control back to the user. Do you think it's a back and forth like that, or do you think that those are waves on a tide that's moving in one direction?
I don't know. I kind of go back and forth myself on that. Because it makes sense to me that I don't know, like, I mean, even thinking about like movies, right? Like sometimes a movie will come out that is very nuanced and critical and sort of weird. And it's not the sort of like factory farmed movie, and it becomes incredibly popular because like people do want like good films at the end of the day, right? Like, and so I think that, and you can also see like a similar kind of swing, I would say, in like human curation versus like algorithmic curation, like people really seeking out, like, for example, like a specific like DJ or a specific person with playlists as opposed to their like Discover Weekly or something. So I do think that there are these sort of latent desires for like the things that are missing or harder to come by. But at the same time, like I don't underestimate the power of, like just this really like widespread system that, and it's like when something begins to be taken for granted, like that's almost to me like the point of no return, because it's like you can't point to it anymore. It's like the person who's on Facebook who no longer realizes they're on Facebook. They're just in there. Like the Patricia Lockwood novel that just came out. No one is talking about this. The main character, who's extremely online, spends all her time on the portal, which is clearly Twitter, but it's just called the portal in the novel. And it's like, yeah, that's what it is. It's the portal. And then you're in the portal and you forgot that you ever even went in there. And you're not thinking about the fact that you're on there or how long you've been on there. You're also like not thinking about the way everything is set up in the space that you're in. You're just kind of going through it and like, so I think that's why I also really love, in addition to artwork that like, gives you some kind of like framing device, art or writing that takes these taken for granted things and just renders them strange, like often with like a very subtle, tweak or something like this, or just placing it outside of its context, where then you can look at it and you're like, whoa, everything about that is weird. Like everything about that is weird. And like, I actually don't have to accept that if I don't want to. I might have to live with it, but Yeah. You can keep it present in your consciousness. I think about that sometimes when I'm in the van and driving up in Idaho, Montana, Oregon, up there. It's so beautiful. And, you drive through these mountains and it's beautiful if you don't know that those mountains used to be covered in forest. If you don't have a historical perspective, you might, if you're a kid or something and you're just like, wow, those mountains are beautiful. And they are. But the beauty, your reaction is in some ways dependent upon your ignorance of, that you're in the portal or the matrix or, there's a great line, this guy named G.K. Chesterton, who is like Oscar Wilde. He's one of these people who's famous for saying all these really witty things. British guy, visited New York City, I think maybe in the 20s or the 30s. And it was the first time he'd been to New York. And his guest took him to Times Square and showed him Times Square at night, all the signs, flashing lights and neon and everything. And he stood there quietly for a long time. Everyone was getting nervous, and finally someone said, so what do you think? And he said, I was just thinking how beautiful this would be if I couldn't read. So true.
It's like, yeah, that says it all.
Yeah.
Anyway, listen, Jenny, congratulations on the success of this book and on the message, which I think is so important. Have you ever floated in a sensory deprivation tank?
It's funny. I haven't, and I live sort of oddly close to one in Oakland.
I can probably hook you up. I'm sort of like because of my connection to Joe Rogan, who sort of brought the whole float thing back to life because he talked about it. And I gave like the keynote address a few years ago at the National Float Conference or something. So if you're interested, let me see if I can hook you up with a few free floats.
That would be amazing. I'm very into that, and I also, it makes me wonder how time will feel when I'm in there.
That's exactly what I wanted to talk about, because in my experience, I mean, I've meditated for years. I've done different things. But to me, floating, like when I try to meditate, I'm always distracted by bodily discomfort. My knees hurt, my back hurts, whatever. Floating, it's just, there's no incoming sensation. You're just suspended in space. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And so it's really easy to go into that meditative state, for me anyway, and time becomes really strange. Like, it's really easy to lose track of time. And I you're in a state where you're like, I don't know if I've been doing this for 5 minutes or an hour and a half. I have no idea. It's really interesting.
Yeah,
So,
totally.
yeah,
And in that
we'll,
time, like, when, like, minutes don't exist, like, they're meaningless. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Your body doesn't exist. It's like your whole narrative changes. It's really interesting. All right, Jenny Odell, thank you. People should go check out your website, which is, what is it, jennyodell.com?
Yes, I was lucky enough to get my own name as a domain. Yeah.
Yeah, you're lucky your name's not Chris Ryan. That was one of the first URLs taken, I think.
Nice.
All right, thanks, Jenny.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Mom, tell people what they can order from the garage.
Okay, in our cottage garage, we have lots and lots of T-shirts. Sex at Dawn, Civilized to Death, Vanthropology, Tangentially Speaking, Paleo Modern, and Talking Out of My Ass.
She didn't like saying that last one.
Then we now have some new things added. We've got beer cozies, or koozies, or whatever they're called.
Oh, Civilized to Death design.
They're all civilized
That's right.
to death.
We have stickers and car decals, right?
Yes.
Okay, there you have it. That's Julie, my mom.
He said, baby, what's a big deal? Feel what you wanna feel. Say what you wanna say. You're gonna die one day. For example, I could kiss you just because I want to. What's the difference if you turn away? I'm gonna die one day. Why do you waste your time thinking about your reputation? Trying to meet an expectation, wondering what they're gonna say. When everyone you've ever known is headed for a headstone. I don't wanna give the end away, but we're gonna die one day. Your body is an animal, doesn't ask for much. A little music and a soft touch. Why don't you let it out to play? Your heart is in a bird cage, singing in your chest. You wanna shut it up but give it a rest. You're gonna die one day. Why do we waste our time thinking about a reputation? Running from a confrontation, wondering what we ought to say. When everyone we've ever known is headed for a headstone. I don't want to give the end away, but we're gonna die one day. We're gonna die one day. We're gonna die one day. So baby, what's a big deal? If you wanna be free, say what you wanna feel. Spend the night with me. I'm gonna take you up in my arms. And if we must go down, we'll go singing to the smoke alarms. We'll dance into the ground.